We are here with Shibley Telhami. He is a professor for peace and development at the University of Maryland, a non-resident senior fellow with the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. He is the author and editor of numerous books, including The One-State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine? He has also advised every U.S. administration from George H.W. Bush to Barack Obama. Welcome, Shibley.
My pleasure.
Can you, for our listeners, just give us a description of the one-state reality that exists on the ground right now and how and why it came to be?
I've been writing about these issues for decades and obviously advised governments on these issues. I was a supporter of two states before it was even popular. I led what we call track two diplomacy, where you're bringing people behind the scenes to bring them together to make peace, particularly Israelis and Palestinians, before they had official dialogues. I thought the two-state solution could bring fairness, if not justice, to both Israelis and Palestinians, fulfillment of aspirations. And I still think if it were to be offered on the table today, I would say to Israelis and Palestinians, jump on it, take it. It could be good for both. The problem is that after the collapse of negotiations in 2000 between Israel and the Palestinians, we kept saying you only have a year or two before it would be no longer possible to have two states. And then 5 years went by. We still kept saying it's 5 minutes to midnight. And then 5 more years, and you'd say 5 minutes to midnight. And you wake up one morning and you look at the situation on the ground and you say, I don't think it's possible anymore. People keep promising a two-state solution, and they use it often with good intentions, but sometimes merely as a smoke screen to cover up a reality that is painful. By the time the book came out last year, there had been 56 years of occupation of the Palestinian territories that were occupied by Israel in 1967. Now, as you know, occupation is supposed to be a temporary state of affairs. More than a half a century is a lifetime for most people. You've had the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank to the point where it became really hard to imagine a contiguous Palestinian state. It was, in essence, a one-state reality. If you reach a one-state reality conclusion, then you have to ask the question, what kind of state is that reality? And it obviously is a deeply unjust state. Now, of course, if we were looking at Israel in its pre-1967 borders, without the West Bank and Gaza, one would not call that an apartheid state. Yes, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 20%, of course, are unequal. They're both structural, even legal discrimination against them. But that's not apartheid. It's inequality. It's not different from many others around the world. But if you look at the relationship between the state and the West Bank, or the state and Gaza, and you consider it one state, then it's very hard to reach the conclusion that it's not at least like apartheid. We now have in the Israeli government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who very obviously envision a supremacy state where the Palestinians either accept the fact that there will be non-citizens under Israeli control forever or else leave. And you put yourself in the position of the Palestinians, then you can see how much despair there was. Long before October 7th, another article I wrote in the spring of last year was that despair was explosive, in part because the Biden administration was initially seen in hopeful terms by the Palestinians. And frankly, the United States under President Biden continued to defend settlements at the United Nations, vetoing UN resolutions that would condemn settlements or oppose settlements. All the peaceful means, UN resolutions, diplomacy with Arab states, interventions by the US were essentially taken away. And that plays into the hands of militants. Now, I need to say something here. A lot of people sometimes forget that in the middle of particularly heated debates that are painful, such as the horrific attack by Hamas against Israel on October 7th, that explanation is not justification. When you're trying to explain something, you're not justifying it. If we don't have explanations, we have no social science. We will never avoid crisis in the future. Explanation is essential. We explain crime. It doesn't mean that we support crime. So a lot of people say when you're explaining the despair as a reason for horrific attack, it's not a justification. Targeting and recklessly endangering civilians is wrong. It's wrong morally, and it's wrong under international humanitarian law. It's considered to be a war crime. It doesn't matter who carries it out, whether it's Palestinians or Israelis or anybody else. But we still need to explain why things happen. There was a lot of despair. Occupation is explosive. And that's why in the article I penned in April of last year, I said, we're likely to see violence on a scale we have never seen before. I use those terms. So yes, there was a one-state reality. It was an explosive reality. I was in both Israel and the West Bank 3 days before the October 7th attack, and you can feel it. Hamas has its own goals, but they read about when is the public desperate enough to kind of applaud them instead of punish them. Now, had there been a peace process with a horizon and they were seen to be a threat to a peace that's coming, they would have been punished and they would have been seen to have been an obstacle by the majority of people. Instead, what you see is the opposite.
If a two-state solution isn't possible, what should outside actors be focused on to improve the situation?
Talking about two states at the moment, when the war isn't even over and we're not doing enough to stop it, is providing another smokescreen and raising hopes that are probably not going to happen. And we don't think a one state with equality is on the horizon either. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians are believing in two states, or for that matter, one state with equality. But if the United States of America think two states is still possible, you can try radical things that might perhaps test that. We don't think it's likely. For example, you declare that you recognize a Palestinian state now. So this is not just about let's work toward two states. Second, you say that you no longer will defend settlements at the United Nations, because those are obviously one of the major obstacles to an implementation of Palestinian state. Third, you say, I will condition aid to Israel based on abiding by international law and not doing anything that jeopardizes two states. And finally, promise Israel ironclad security defense by the United States within its recognized borders. Those are the kind of things you could put on the table. Now, I happen to think it's probably too late for that, but maybe I'm wrong, and I have been wrong before. But if that's not what's going to happen, then you, as the United States of America, which has an extraordinary lever, what you do is you say, I am going to basically make my policy based on the behavior rather than on the outcome. And therefore, I'm going to say what is not acceptable, what our red lines are. For example, no expulsion of Palestinians. For example, we'll not put up with an apartheid domination. For example, we will not accept violations of international law by either side, Palestinians or Israelis. We will condition aid according to those principles. That would be a policy far more fruitful if it's implemented than anything that we might promise.
The big lever, obviously, that the US has specifically is the amount of aid that we give Israel. Talking purely about these international institutions like the UN, I guess one question that I had reading the article is how effective international institutions can be when it comes to Israel at this point. Like there's maybe a way in which Netanyahu kind of relishes his role of standing against the sort of liberal order, I guess. It seems like he at least really senses that's what gives him his domestic political success, is this very us against the world attitude that he has. So does sanction from international institutions drive Netanyahu and sort of the Israeli political climate further into right-wing retrenchment?
You're right, though, about how he uses sort of the all against us. And there's resonance for that message, obviously, in Israel. And a lot of people link it to anti-Semitism. And there's fear, and it's a legitimate fear, right? Whatever the causes of the Hamas attack, It created real fear in Israel about vulnerability, including among people who are not in Netanyahu's camp, right? So the psychology is transformed and it becomes a zero-sum game. We see it on both sides. I mean, let's be realistic. But the international organizations have a major impact, particularly International Security Council resolutions. We haven't tested that in part because the US has constantly vetoed any Security Council resolution that might have teeth related to Israel. If you remove that protection, there will be implications because as the International Court, the criminal court then kicks in, and there are cases that could come out of it. If the International Court of Justice finds that, in fact, genocide is taking place, that's a binding resolution. But the International Court of Justice cannot implement them. And in that sense, you're right, international organizations don't have. But the UN Security Council can implement them. So in order to make them truly binding and therefore consequential also for cases in the International Criminal Court, you really have to pass it as a Security Council resolution. The only reason that doesn't happen is the United States wouldn't let that happen. Certainly, there's a lot of support in Washington for Israeli security for sure. And I think that goes beyond Republicans, a lot of Democrats. But there is also very high level of increasing discomfort with what's happening in the Gaza war. I have been doing a lot of polling on American public attitudes toward Israel, Palestine for decades, literally decades. I don't think anyone has done as much polling on this as I have. It's dating back. My first poll was the late 1980s, and I wrote a major article about this in the early 1990s. And there has been a major transformation for sure, especially among young people, but not only young Democrats. In some polling, I even found shift among young evangelicals, the group that is most supportive of the Israeli right agenda. In a poll I did in 2021, when there was fighting between Israel and Hamas, just months after Biden came to office, half of young Democrats disapproved of Biden's handling of that war, which was totally supportive of the Israeli government. That was correlated likely with his first drop in approval rating nationally, because that drop came mostly from Democrats. I am actually sensing, honestly, that the president has hurt himself politically a lot, and that he might even lose this election over this issue. There's a sense that young people, they're not going to vote for Trump. Yeah, I think up to a point, most of them will not, for sure. The question is, will they vote for Biden? Will they stay home?
Right.
Will they vote but not take their friends with them to vote?
There has been suggestion that governments like the US and UK should just recognize Palestinian nationhood. Some say the symbolism is important, and others say the symbolism is to the side of the point, given the human rights catastrophe going on in Gaza. So can you talk about your perspective on the value of international recognition of a Palestinian state?
I think that at this point, recognition is a bit of a distraction from ending the war now, which needs to be done. It's already too late in some ways because so many lives had been radically changed and destroyed. We're on the verge of famine. Many more could die of hunger. So I think all our efforts should go entirely into ending this war. The longer this war goes on, aside from the more tragedy for the Palestinians, the more chance of an escalation. And we already know that there are people certainly within the Israeli right, who want to expand the war to include Hezbollah in Lebanon, which would be devastating to both countries. And it can also draw Iran in. But even if the war ends tomorrow, I don't think we have internalized the extent to which both Israelis and Palestinians are traumatized. I mean, Gaza, as we know it, doesn't exist anymore. The infrastructure is completely destroyed.
Probably what is the most awkward transition ever, turning to Eurovision. We'll talk about the actual controversy, which is whether Israel should participate. But there's another story. In 2008, PBC, the Palestinian public broadcaster, actually applied to be a full member of the European Broadcasting Union, and therefore in Eurovision. They were rejected from that. it kind of brings up a little bit this idea of permission to narrate and who gets to tell your story and your history. That's a long wind up to asking what you think the responsibility is of these cultural soft power institutions and how you think that they could or could not help in advancing justice.
That's a great question. And I don't think that's an awkward segue at all. I actually see it as kind of integral. Let me tell you why. Connected with something you said earlier about how Netanyahu dismisses international organizations and opinion and all that. But remember what happened in this particular case of Israel's entry into Eurovision. When Eurovision demanded the changes, what persuaded the team was the president of Israel, who said, no, change it. Why? Because it's very important to be present and have the Israeli flag there. And it doesn't matter in any way the words, but just be there. It matters for a lot of reasons. It matters, obviously, because public opinion matters and it's increasingly mobilized. I'm going to say this now, but I've not released this poll. I asked people whether they want the US government to make spreading democracy in the world a goal of American foreign policy. I got mixed results. About only 1/3 say yes and about 1/3 say no. I asked whether they want human rights to be a goal of American foreign policy. I get 2/3 of Americans say yes, including a majority of Republicans, a majority of Democrats, and a majority of independents. And when you ask them, what is the best way to push human rights globally, the number one answer is through international organizations. These issues that we were talking about that matter globally and across borders, they are galvanizing issues. And the third thing I want to say about it is that, obviously Eurovision as an institution is extremely important because of the number of people who follow. And if you recall, I said that I wrote a piece last spring saying the Biden administration was taking away all the peaceful ways to help end the injustice, playing into the hands of militants. But if you're not going to bring in every conceivable avenue of bringing peaceful leverage, how are you going to get it? How are people going to believe that it's possible? Finally, people underestimate the power of art. I'm in the position of politics. I know because I make political arguments and I make analytical arguments, and I hope they're important. But honestly, sometimes one image, one song can do a lot more than any great speech. And there is a power of art in society that has to be used in this peaceful way of weighing in on behalf of justice. And I have started a program here many years ago called the Sadat Art for Justice and Peace, where I have a competition among artists on campus. This year, it's on freedom of speech, using Frederick Douglass's statement that violating freedom of speech is really violating the rights of both the speaker and the hearer. What comes out of it is incredibly important. It's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly influential because artists, they're also social critics. We all think about the same issues. It's not just for the experts, not just for the politicians, not just for the academics or the social scientists. We're all part of the same society. We're all dealing with the same issues. We all have the same pain. We all have our voices. And I think that, yes, of course, Eurovision is something important. And what comes out of it is important. And yes, it should weigh in on behalf of human rights and justice around the world.
I think that's the perfect place to end.
Yeah.
Professor Telhami, this has been incredible. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.